HOA laughed when I warned them. The HOA board sat there, polished smiles hiding their arrogance, pretending the cracks in the foundation were just cosmetic. I remember the sound of their laughter echoing through that sterile meeting hall. It wasn't just ignorance, it was pride. They believed they were untouchable, that nothing I said could ever shake their little kingdom of control. But when the earth began to tremble weeks later, and their million-dollar dream started sinking into the ground, that laughter turned to screams. I wish I could say I was surprised. I had seen it coming, the shifting walls, the uneven floors, the small signs no one wanted to acknowledge. I begged them to listen, not for power, not for revenge, but because I knew what was buried beneath us. They ignored me. They called me dramatic, a troublemaker, even threatened me with fines if I continued spreading panic. And then one morning, the ground gave way, swallowing everything they thought was permanent. Watching the footage now, you can almost feel the air thicken with disbelief as concrete cracks like brittle glass and their world literally falls apart. Some call it karma, others say it was just bad luck, but I know better. Because the truth behind what really caused that collapse, what the HOA tried to cover up, runs much deeper than anyone imagined. And when it all came to light, no one was laughing anymore. So, what really happened beneath that building? For years, the neighborhood had felt like the perfect picture of peace, rows of tidy lawns, mailboxes gleaming under the morning sun, and a silence so predictable you could almost hear time pass. My home sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, framed by two oak trees that had been there long before the HOA ever existed. It wasn't grand or new, but it was a small piece of stability after years of moving from place to place. Every morning, I'd walk out with my coffee, nod to the neighbors, and feel the quiet rhythm of a community that seemed unshakable. But peace in an HOA neighborhood is fragile. It can shatter the moment someone decides control matters more than community. The HOA board wasn't elected by passion or fairness, it was ruled by pride. The president, a woman named Carol, wore her authority like a crown, always reminding us that rules keep order. Her smile was polite, but her eyes carried the sharpness of someone who loved power more than people. Most homeowners stayed silent. They'd seen what happened when someone questioned the board. Letters would show up, threats disguised as notices, small acts of pressure that made resistance feel dangerous. Still, I didn't mind the rules, at least. Not until the day I noticed the first crack in my driveway. It was small, barely visible, a hairline split cutting across the edge of the concrete. I thought little of it at first. After all, every structure ages. But over the next few weeks, that tiny line grew, spreading like a spiderweb across my yard, creeping toward the foundation of my house. When I walked the neighborhood, I saw the same pattern repeating: driveways splitting, sidewalks lifting, and hairline fractures climbing up the walls of several homes. It wasn't weather, it wasn't normal. Something was shifting beneath us. I mentioned it casually during one of the HOA's open meetings, suggesting that maybe it was worth looking into. Carol glanced at me over her glasses, her expression dripping with condescension. "Minor settling," she said, waving her hand like it was nothing. The others nodded along, eager to move on to their usual business, approving fines, debating mailbox colors, policing Christmas decorations. But that night, as I stood outside under the streetlights, I could feel it, the faint, unnatural vibration under my feet, the kind that makes your stomach tighten without knowing why. Over the next few days, I started documenting the cracks, measuring them, taking photos, even talking to a few neighbors who had noticed the same. Some were concerned, others shrugged it off. The HOA, however, didn't appreciate my persistence. Within a week, I received a letter, formal warning for creating unnecessary alarm within the community. The message was clear: stay quiet. I should have stopped there, played along like everyone else. But something about the tone of that letter didn't sit right with me. If they were so confident everything was fine, why silence me? The more I asked questions, the colder the board became. Emails went unanswered, meeting minutes were redacted, and soon, I was the subject of whispered conversations. I could feel the shift in the air: neighbors avoiding eye contact, board members exchanging smirks when I walked by. It wasn't paranoia, it was isolation by design. Then came the contractor incident. A friend of mine, who worked in structural engineering, offered to take a look unofficially. One afternoon, as he began examining the soil near the foundation, a white SUV rolled up. The HOA president herself, with 2 board members in tow. They stood there, arms crossed, demanding to know what we were doing. When I explained, Carol's expression turned from polite to hostile. "You are not authorized to conduct private inspections on common property," she snapped, even though we were standing on my land. That was the first time I saw the fear behind her control. She wasn't just dismissing me, she was hiding something. Days later, my friend told me quietly that the soil readings were unusual. There was moisture far deeper than expected, the kind that suggested a leak or underground instability. When I mentioned this at the next meeting, the room went cold. Carol interrupted me mid-sentence, gavel in hand, declaring the matter closed. But the cracks didn't stop growing. They multiplied. Walls creaked at night, doors wouldn't close, and small tremors shook picture frames loose. I started keeping notes on everything: dates, sounds, even the way the ground seemed to sink slightly near the park where the HOA had approved a new drainage project. The pattern was too precise to ignore. Something beneath us was collapsing slowly, invisibly, and they didn't want anyone to find out. Looking back, that was the moment normal life ended. The laughter of children outside, the Sunday barbecues, the gentle peace that once filled the street, it all started to fade, replaced by a quiet dread no one wanted to name. And yet, through all the denial, all the intimidation, I knew one thing for certain: the truth was right beneath our feet, and it was only a matter of time before it broke through the surface for everyone to see. The first notice arrived, folded neatly in a white envelope, tucked beneath my doormat like a snake in the grass. It looked harmless, almost polite, until I read the bold print at the top. Violation: property maintenance concern. According to the the crack running along my driveway was now classified as an aesthetic hazard, one that threatened community value. They demanded it be repaired within 10 days or face escalating fines. I stood there in disbelief. The very issue I had warned them about, cracks caused by something deeper beneath the ground, was now being used against me. It wasn't just unfair, it was deliberate. I could feel their hand tightening around me, subtle but calculated. Within days, the second notice arrived, this time about unauthorized structural evaluation. They were referring to the brief inspection my engineer friend had done. Apparently, it violated community protocol. The fine, $500. I laughed bitterly. It wasn't about money, it was about control. The HOA had turned my concern into their weapon. From that moment, the tone of the neighborhood shifted. Neighbors who once waved from their porches began to look away. Conversations stopped when I passed. Even the kids who used to ride bikes in front of my house seemed to find new routes. Isolation had begun. One evening, I returned home to find Carol, the HOA president, standing at the edge of my yard, clipboard in hand. She didn't say a word, just jotted something down and walked away. 2 days later, another notice. Yard maintenance issue: overgrown shrubbery. My shrubs hadn't changed in months. They were reaching for anything now, any pretext to bury me under fines and shame. I appealed, of course. I attended the next board meeting.com, but determined. I presented photos, timestamped records, proof that the cracks were worsening and spreading beyond my property. I showed the same sections in other yards, the same soil displacement, the same pattern. But as I spoke, I could feel the indifference suffocating the room. Carol leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen with a smirk that said more than her words ever could. "We appreciate your concern," she said finally, her tone syrupy. "But the board has already consulted with professionals who found no structural risks. The matter is considered closed." That phrase, again closed. The word echoed in my mind like a door slamming shut. When I asked for the reports or the names of the professionals they'd hired, she refused, citing confidentiality. I left that night with a pit in my stomach, a sense that something much bigger was being hidden behind their rules and polished smiles. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. My mailbox was vandalized twice. I'd wake up to find footprints in the soft soil near my foundation, as if someone had been walking around my property in the middle of the night. Calls from the HOA became more frequent, each one cloaked in bureaucratic civility but dripping with veiled threats. "Failure to comply may result in legal action," they'd say, "or you are creating unnecessary alarm among other residents." I started documenting everything, that is, photos, even the times of night when I'd hear faint rumbling under the ground. The tremors were growing stronger, no longer imaginary. Cups rattled on shelves. A hairline crack began to trace itself along my living room wall like a warning drawn in stone. Still, the HOA refused to acknowledge any issue. Their denial was now personal. It wasn't about community, it was about protecting their image, their control. I decided to dig deeper. I hired a professional soil analyst on my own, using a different address to avoid HOA interference. When the results came back, my suspicions were confirmed. The water table had shifted dramatically beneath the neighborhood. The new drainage system installed by the HOA's chosen contractor had redirected groundwater in ways that compromised the foundation stability of several lots, mine included. It was negligence. Maybe worse. Armed with the report, I returned to the next HOA meeting, heart pounding, camera discreetly recording in my pocket. As I began to explain what the report found, Carol interrupted, her face tightening. "This information is false," she snapped. "You are spreading misinformation that could damage property values." The board voted right then to fine me again for defamation of the HOA. The audience, a handful of silent homeowners, just watched. Some looked afraid to even meet my eyes. I walked out trembling, not from fear, but from fury. They weren't just ignoring the danger, they were burying it. Literally. That night, I sat in my car in front of the HOA office, watching as Carol and two board members carried boxes into their cars long after hours. I couldn't see what was inside, but it was clear they were moving documents, maybe hiding evidence. The next morning, the HOA portal was updated. Meeting minutes had been erased. For the past 3 months, every trace of my complaint gone. It felt surreal, like gaslight in broad daylight. But something in me refused to back down. I began sharing the evidence anonymously online, under a pseudonym. I posted photos of the cracks, soil reports, videos of the tremors. Within days, whispers started circulating around the neighborhood. People began to question the HOA's silence. One neighbor quietly slipped a note into my mailbox. "You're right. My garage floor is sinking too. Please, be careful, they're watching." That single note both terrified and empowered me. I wasn't alone anymore. But that also meant the HOA would push harder. And they did. I received the notice stating that my property was now under special observation for compliance. The irony was bitter. They were watching me, not the ground that was collapsing beneath us. A week later, a local inspector showed up at my door, claiming to be conducting a routine assessment. I had never requested one. When I asked who sent him, he hesitated before muttering, "HOA board authorization." They were trying to intimidate me with official presence now, to make me feel cornered. But what they didn't realize was that every visit, every warning, every fine only strengthened my resolve. Something was deeply wrong. And if I didn't expose it, someone could get hurt or worse. One night, around midnight, I felt a deep vibration shake the floor beneath me, stronger than ever before. It wasn't a truck. It wasn't the wind. It was the earth groaning under pressure. I ran outside, and in the distance, near the park, I saw something horrifying. A section of the ground had sunk in several inches, swallowing part of the newly installed drainage pipe. The next day, I reported it, sending photos to the board and copying the city's inspection office. The HOA responded within hours, not with concern, but with another fine: unauthorized distribution of false imagery. The notice read, they called the photos doctored. That was when I realized the board wasn't just ignorant, they were actively covering up a disaster. My phone began to buzz constantly with blocked numbers. When I answered once, a cold voice whispered, "Stop before you regret it." My camera footage later showed a car idling outside my home for hours that same night. Fear started to crawl under my skin, but so did defiance. I began backing up all my evidence onto multiple drives, storing them in safe places. If they wanted a war of silence, I would answer with truth. But I had no idea how far they were willing to go to keep theirs buried. A few days later, I returned home to find an official-looking notice nailed to my front door, something they'd never done before. It was a cease and desist from the HOA's attorney, accusing me of defamation and disruption. I was ordered to remove all online posts or face legal action. The irony burned. I was being threatened for exposing what could save lives. Still, part of me hesitated. They had money, lawyers, influence. I was just one homeowner. But then, as I looked around the street that night, silent houses, Dark windows, cracks glinting under the streetlights. I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. The HOA had built their kingdom on fear and silence. I had nothing left to lose by breaking it. The tension in the air was electric. A quiet storm building beneath every step we took in that neighborhood. I didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath us wasn't the only thing ready to give way. Something far more explosive was about to surface, and when it did, no one, not even Carol and her precious board, would be able to contain it. The next week began with silence, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that feels staged, like everyone is holding their breath before something snaps. The HOA had gone quiet after the cease and desist letter. No calls, no emails, no notices. It should have been a relief, but I could sense it was the calm before a strike. Every night, I'd step outside and feel that same low tremor beneath my feet, like a pulse under the ground. My phone buzzed constantly with anonymous text short messages, like "you redone or stop digging." Some were worse, cruel things meant to rattle me. I reported them to the police, but without proof of who sent them, nothing could be done. The officer I spoke to hinted that this wasn't the first complaint involving that HOA. They had a reputation for using intimidation to silence homeowners. That small admission lit a fire in me. If the system wouldn't hold them accountable, then maybe exposure would. I contacted a local reporter who specialized in community disputes, someone known for uncovering small-town corruption. When I explained the situation and shared the photos and soil report, she hesitated, then said, "If what you're saying is true, this could be serious." She promised to look into it quietly. I knew the risk. If the board found out, they'd come after me harder, but I was past caring. What I didn't realize was that they already knew. 2 days later, I noticed a black SUV parked half a block from my house. It wasn't a neighbor's. It sat there day after day, engine off, windows tinted. Once, when I approached, it pulled away slowly, only to return after midnight. I started to wonder if I was being paranoid. But then one evening, as I checked my mailbox, I found a stack of HOA newsletters addressed to everyone in the community. The front page carried an article titled, "Community Safety Reminder. Beware of false claims online." They didn't name me directly, but they didn't need to. The description fit me perfectly. A resident spreading misinformation about neighborhood infrastructure. They even hinted that I was under possible investigation for slander. It was a public humiliation wrapped in politeness. The next morning, the neighbors' looks confirmed it. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when I walked by. A mother pulled her child closer as I passed. The sense of belonging I'd once felt had rotted into suspicion. Still, that evening, as I watched the sunset bleed over the cracked concrete, I told myself the truth doesn't need an audience to exist. It just needs persistence. I doubled down, documenting everything more meticulously: videos, timestamps, vibrations logged daily. The cracks were spreading faster now, and not just at my house. A retaining wall 2 streets over had split open, revealing damp soil underneath. I took photos, added them to my file, and forwarded them to the reporter. Her reply came the next day. City records showed the HOA's drainage project wasn't approved by licensed engineers. My breath caught. That was the missing piece. The board had bypassed proper inspections to save money, and now the entire neighborhood was sitting on compromised ground. But before I could process it, the retaliation escalated. That weekend, I woke to the stench of something burning. My trash bins had been set on fire. The flames were small and controlled, but the message was unmistakable. The police filed another report, though the officer's tone was weary, like he'd already given up on finding who did it. Carol arrived later that afternoon, standing just beyond the property line. Her expression feigned concern. "So unfortunate," she said, her voice syrupy. "It would be a shame if the board had to consider your property a safety risk." Then she turned and left before I could respond. That night, I barely slept. The walls creaked as if the house itself shared my anxiety. Around 3 in the morning, a sharp cracking sound jolted me upright, the kind of noise that makes your heart stop before your mind catches up. I ran outside barefoot and saw it. The concrete walkway leading to my porch had split down the middle, the gap wide enough to fit my hand. I shone a flashlight inside and saw moisture glistening deep within the earth. Whatever was happening underground was accelerating. I sent another report to the city, attaching new photos, and called the reporter, leaving a voicemail that sounded more like a plea. The next morning, the HOA struck again. A certified letter awaited me on the doorstep, this time announcing that due to repeated violations and property hazards, my membership privileges were suspended. I could no longer attend meetings or vote on community matters. In their eyes, I no longer existed. But that was their mistake. Silencing me only made me louder. I leaked every document I had to the reporter, the soil analyses, the erased meeting minutes, even footage of the collapsing drainage trench near the park. Within a week, she called back. "We're running it," she said, excitement and fear blending in her voice. "But once it airs, things are going to move fast. Be ready." I thought I was ready. I wasn't. 2 nights before the story went live, someone broke into my backyard. I heard the fence rattle, then footsteps. When I rushed outside with a flashlight, there was no one, but the garden hose had been slashed and my motion cameras ripped from their mounts. I felt a chill that no warm air could shake. They were desperate now, cornered animals protecting their secret. I called the police again, and this time they stationed a patrol car nearby. The officer admitted quietly that several other homeowners had recently filed structural complaints, all of which the HOA dismissed. He said, "If what you're saying is true, this could blow up." Blow up it was an unfortunate choice of words, because the next morning, the ground did exactly that. A section of pavement near the drainage system collapsed inward, leaving a gaping hole big enough to swallow a car. Workers in orange vests rushed to block it off, but the damage was done. Photos hit social media before noon. The HOA scrambled, releasing a statement blaming unusual weather conditions. But everyone could see the truth now. The same cracks that lined my property ran across half the neighborhood. People began knocking on my door. The same neighbors who once avoided me, now terrified, asking what they should do. Some begged for copies of my reports. Others whispered about suing the board. The silence that had once suffocated the street was replaced by anger, by panic. Caro called an emergency meeting, and though I'd been banned, I went anyway. The room was chaos, homeowners shouting, demanding answers, waving photos of damage. Carol tried to speak over them, insisting everything was under control, but her composure was gone. I watched her hands tremble as she shuffled her notes. When I stood to speak, the room fell quiet. "You ignored every warning," I said, voice steady. "You buried the evidence, and now people's homes are sinking because of your negligence." Carol's face drained of color. She started to deny it again, but this time no one believed her. Someone shouted that they'd seen her meeting the contractor late at night. Another claimed she'd approved budget changes off record. The walls of her power began to crack, just like the ground outside. By the time the reporter's story aired the next evening, the damage was irreversible. The broadcast showed side-by-side footage of the neighborhood before and after the HOA's drainage project, interviews with homeowners, and excerpts from the city's inspection records confirming no permits had been issued. The final segment showed my documentation, the soil report, the erased meeting minutes, the fines, the harassment. My name was out now. I expected retaliation, maybe lawsuits, but instead came silence. The HOA office was locked the next morning. Carol had resigned overnight. 2 board members were reportedly under investigation for falsifying maintenance records. But victory didn't feel like relief. The neighborhood was a war zone of caution tape and cracked pavement. The illusion of order shattered. Standing there among the debris, I realized how fragile everything had always been. Not just the homes, but the trust, the community, the belief that someone was looking out for us. I should have felt vindicated, but all I felt was exhaustion. Still, beneath the fatigue was something sharper resolve. The truth was finally in the open, but the real reckoning hadn't begun yet. Investigators would come, insurance companies would swarm, and as for me, I knew this story wasn't over. Because even as they blamed faulty construction and weather, there was something deeper still, something no one wanted to talk about. The vibrations hadn't stopped. The ground was still shifting. The collapse that had already swallowed part of the park was spreading outward, slowly but steadily. Standing there, watching the soil sink in the distance, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the earth wasn't done revealing what the HOA tried so hard to hide. The lies were cracking open, and soon, everything they'd built, every rule, every threat, every polished smile would fall with them. The day the truth went public was the day everything shattered. By morning, the local news vans lined the street, their antennas piercing the sky like metallic accusations. Reporters were already outside, pointing cameras toward the cracked pavement and the sinking homes, narrating what the HOA had spent months trying to bury. The air buzzed with panic and vindication, a strange mix that felt like justice clawing its way through the wreckage. My phone rang non-stop. Neighbors, journalists, even strangers from nearby towns calling to ask how something like this could happen. But, amid the noise, one thing stood out. The HOA had gone silent. No emails, no statements, nothing. It was as if their perfect world had finally collapsed under the weight of its own lies. Still, I knew silence wasn't surrendered, was retreat. They were planning something. I could feel it in the way their lawyer's name started appearing in my inbox again, in the carefully worded letters demanding I cease all defamatory communication. But this time, I wasn't alone. The city had stepped in. An emergency inspection was ordered. Engineers, inspectors, and camera crews swarmed the neighborhood, and when they began digging near the drainage system, the secret finally surfaced. Beneath the concrete lay rusted pipes, poorly fitted and leaking gallons of groundwater directly into the soil. It was the smoking gun, proof that the HOA's unapproved project had destabilized the land. As cameras rolled, the lead inspector said quietly, "This should never have been built." The footage spread instantly. Within hours, the HOA's office was surrounded by angry residents demanding answers. I stood at the edge of the crowd, unseen, but watching, heart pounding. Carol appeared at the door, her face pale and tight. For months, she had ruled with confidence, every word precise and sharp, but now her voice cracked as she tried to calm them. "We acted within our authority," she said, clutching her binder like a shield. The project was for the safety of the community, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Voices shouted back questions, accusations, years of resentment erupting all at once. Someone yelled about fines, another about bullying, another about the sinking foundation of their home. The dam had burst. Carol tried to retreat inside, but a city official stopped her at the door. "Ma'am, we have a warrant to access your office." The color drained from her face. She stammered something about legal counsel, but the official motioned her aside. Cameras caught every second the woman who once controlled everyone's property with threats and paperwork, now powerless against the weight of her own corruption. I should have felt triumph, but instead, a heavy stillness settled over me. This wasn't just about her, it was about all of us who let fear and silence grow roots. As investigators carried boxes of documents out of the building, I saw Carol glance toward me. For the first time, she looked human, fragile, even scared. Maybe she realized how far she'd gone to protect the illusion of control. Maybe she was thinking about the cracks that had started all of this. The ones she refused to believe were real until the ground opened beneath her feet. That night, the city declared parts of the neighborhood unsafe for residents. People evacuated, loading cars with whatever they could carry. Streetlights flickered against the hollow shells of once perfect homes. I stayed behind, sitting on my porch, watching the evacuation trucks roll by. The air smelled like wet earth and regret. Then, headlights cut through the darkness. Carol's white SUV, pulling into my driveway. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. She stepped out, her usual poise gone, hands shaking as she approached. "You ruined me," she said quietly, her voice trembling, not with anger but disbelief. "Do you think they'll forgive you for this? You've destroyed their community." I stared at her. The woman who had fined me, harassed me, and silenced me, now trying to make herself the victim. "I didn't destroy it," I said. "You did when you decided the truth didn't matter." She looked away, tears streaking through her makeup. "You think they'll thank you when their property values crash, when no one wants to live here anymore?" I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that could make her see the irony. She had built this empire on appearances, and now the facade was crumbling along with the foundations she ignored. She turned to leave, then stopped. "You could have stayed quiet," she whispered. "You could have kept your home." I felt a cold calm wash over me. I'd rather lose my house than my conscience. Her eyes hardened for a moment, and then she drove away, tires spitting gravel as she disappeared into the dark. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time anyone saw her for days. The next morning, word spread, Carol had resigned officially. But the city found shredded documents in her office, financial discrepancies tied to the contractor she'd hired. She had taken kickbacks to push the project through. It was fraud. The revelation hit the community like a second quake. Anger turned into disbelief, then sorrow. The same neighbors who once avoided me now came forward, apologizing, sharing their own stories of intimidation. It was vindication, but it felt hollow. The neighborhood was fractured physically and emotionally. The HOA that once dictated every blade of grass was gone, its authority stripped by the same system it had abused. But the ground still trembled, faint and persistent, as if reminding me the story wasn't finished. The inspectors said the collapse wasn't isolated, the underground water pressure was spreading. The damage was irreversible. The very land we'd built our lives on was sinking. Standing there, watching engineers mark my property with red flags, I realized how fitting it was. The cracks had always been a warning of pride, of blindness, of power misused. And now, nature itself was enforcing the justice no board or lawyer ever could. Yet, even as the earth sank, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was about to surface, something far more personal. Because just when I thought I'd seen the end of the HOA's reach, one final letter arrived in my mailbox, postmarked the day before Carol vanished. It wasn't from the board, it was from her, handwritten, shaky ink bleeding through the paper. The message was short, but the last line made my blood run cold. "You were right about the ground, but there's something under it you don't understand." I read that line over and over until the words blurred. Something under it you don't understand. At first, I thought it was a last-ditch attempt at manipulation, one final riddle to pull me back into the chaos she'd created. But the phrasing haunted me. Carol wasn't poetic, she was precise. Everything she did was calculated. If she wrote that, there had to be something she wanted hidden. I waited until the inspectors left for the night, and walked down to the edge of the construction site where the sinkhole had first appeared. The moon hung low, silvering the ground with ghostly light. The soil was soft, the air heavy with that damp, metallic smell that follows a storm. I crouched near the caution tape and noticed something I hadn't seen before: concrete fragments that didn't match the neighborhood as materials. These pieces were older, rougher, and among them, a faint metallic glint caught my eye. I brushed the dirt away and found a corroded plaque. The letters were nearly gone, but I could make out enough to read. Municipal Reservoir Decommissioned, 1979. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just about faulty pipes or greed. The HOA had built their safety drainage project directly over an abandoned water containment system, one that was supposed to have been sealed decades ago. They hadn't just ignored warnings, they had reawakened a buried hazard. The entire community was literally built on hollow ground. I grabbed my phone and called the city engineer, but he didn't answer. I tried again. Nothing. That's when I heard it: a low, deep rumble beneath my feet, followed by a sharp crack that split through the stillness like a gunshot. I stumbled back as the soil shifted, collapsing inward another few inches. The rumble grew louder, the air vibrating with pressure, and then silence. The ground seemed to exhale. I turned to run, but headlights blinded me. A white SUV rolled to a stop. Carol's. She stepped out, looking disheveled, hair undone, eyes wide. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed. "They'll blame you if it happens tonight." "What happens tonight?" I demanded. "What's under here, Carol?" Her gaze darted toward the sinkhole, then back to me. "The board knew," she said, voice trembling. "They all knew. That's why they pushed the project. They needed to drain it before it ruptured. But when they realized how much it would cost, they stopped halfway. They told me to cover it up, say it was maintenance." I didn't think. She broke off, clutching her head. "They promised me a bonus, funding for my son's college, everything. And now it's going to collapse." My pulse hammered. "Then we need to call the city, get everyone out." But before I could finish, the earth groaned again. The sound was deeper this time, closer, like something dragging beneath the surface. Carol staggered, gripping the car door. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's already happening." I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the street. "Move!" We ran as the ground behind us began to fracture. Cracks snaked across the asphalt like lightning, swallowing fences, sidewalks, and streetlights. Houses tilted. Alarms wailed, glass shattered. It was chaos: screams, dogs barking, the sound of collapsing foundations. And through it all, the sky glowed red from the reflection of emergency lights flooding the neighborhood. When we reached the main road, I turned back. Half of the subdivision was gone. The place that had once symbolized control and order was now a sinking graveyard of broken ambition. Carol fell to her knees, sobbing. "I didn't mean for this," she cried. "I thought I could fix it." I knelt beside her, breath ragged. "You can't fix something built on lies." She looked up, eyes hollow. "Then maybe it's better it all falls." Before I could respond, a deafening crack split the air. The HOA office, once her kingdom, buckled and vanished into the earth, swallowed whole. The crowd behind the barricades gasped as dust and debris rose like a wave. And just like that, the symbol of her power was gone. Emergency crews swarmed the scene. Reporters shouted questions. I stood there, covered in dirt, watching it all unfold like a nightmare I'd already lived in my mind 100 times. Carol was taken away in an ambulance, not under arrest yet, but broken physically and emotionally. I gave my statement to the police, told them everything about the letters, the pipes, the reservoir. When I mentioned her note, the detective's expression darkened. "We'll need that," he said, "and we'll need to know why she thought you'd be blamed." That question lingered in my head long after they left. The next morning, I woke to silence. The neighborhood was cordoned off, a disaster zone. News reports called it a catastrophic infrastructure failure. But I knew better. It was a failure of greed, denial, and fear. A few residents came by to check on me, people who once avoided eye contact, now offering food, water, apologies. One man said, "You tried to warn us. We didn't listen." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because, as I stood there, staring at the ruins, I realized something terrifying. The sinkhole had stopped spreading right at the border of my property, as if the land itself had drawn a line. Later that afternoon, the city returned with heavy equipment to survey the remaining ground. One of the engineers called me over. "You'll want to see this," he said, pointing into a shallow pit near the edge of the collapse. Buried beneath layers of soil was a large, sealed metal hatch, rusted and chained shut. "This isn't on any map," he said. "It's like they tried to cover it up." I recognized the logo faintly etched into the surface. It matched the old municipal emblem from the plaque I'd found. The reservoir wasn't just underground, it was still sealed, still full. "Karo S." Last words echoed in my head. "There's something under it you don't understand." I stepped closer, peering into the darkness of the pit. A faint hissing sound rose from below, steady and rhythmic. Gas, maybe, pressure, something alive in the silence. The engineer motioned for the crew to back up. "We need hazmat here before we open it." I nodded, but a cold dread spread through me. I suddenly understood what she meant. This wasn't just about corruption, it was about danger. Whatever was buried here wasn't meant to be disturbed, and the HOA, in their arrogance, had done it anyway. By nightfall, the emergency teams returned with containment gear. Reporters were everywhere, drones buzzing overhead. I stood at a distance as they cut through the chains and pried the hatch open. A gust of foul air burst out, so strong it knocked one of the workers back. Cameras flashed. Someone yelled, seal it," and then everything went dark. The generators, the lights, the cameras. In the chaos, I saw something move below, something that shimmered wetly before the light died completely. The officials quickly sealed the hatch again, ordering everyone back. No one said what they saw. No one spoke of it afterward. The official report called it an unstable methane leak, but I saw the fear in their eyes. Whatever was under there wasn't just gas or water. It was older, something the city had buried, and the HOA had awakened. As dawn broke over the wreckage, I sat on the curb, watching the rising sun spill light over the fractured land. The neighborhood was gone. Carol was gone. The HOA's name would forever be linked to one of the most catastrophic failures in local history. And yet, beneath the calm morning, I could still feel the faint vibration under my feet, the heartbeat of something still alive below. The story wasn't over. The ground had taken its revenge, but it wasn't done. And as I watched the officials fence off the area, I realized the truth Carol had been too afraid to say aloud. This place was never meant to be lived on. It was meant to stay buried. The days following the collapse felt unreal, as if the entire neighborhood had been caught between two worlds, one built on illusion and another that finally forced its way to the surface. The once pristine lawns, manicured hedges, and perfectly aligned driveways were now nothing but fractured memories, swallowed by the truth they tried to conceal. I stood at the edge of the caution tape for what felt like hours each morning, watching the heavy machinery move earth that refused to stay still. The hum of excavators became the new sound of the neighborhood, drowning out the gossip, the denial, the control. Every resident who had once preached order and obedience now looked lost, carrying the weight of realizing that the system they defended had turned against them. The HOA board, what was left of it, was officially disbanded within the week. Investigations started almost immediately. City officials, engineers, and state inspectors poured in, each uncovering another layer of negligence and deceit. They found altered blueprints, falsified reports, and missing safety documents that traced all the way back to the original construction permits. For years, corners had been cut, money rerouted, signatures forged, all in the name of efficiency and profit. And while Karel had been the face of the HOA, she wasn't the only one responsible. Several contractors and city liaisons were quietly questioned, and the whispers that followed hinted at a corruption scheme larger than anyone had imagined. But what struck me most was how quickly people began rewriting the story. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped by with nervous smiles and hollow apologies. They talked about how they always suspected something was wrong, or how they wanted to speak up but didn't know how. I nodded politely. But inside, a strange calm had settled. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out long ago, replaced by something quieter: acceptance. The truth had surfaced, and it had done so in the most undeniable way possible. For the first time, silence felt like peace. Weeks turned into months. The collapsed zone was declared a restricted area, fenced off and guarded, but reconstruction talks began almost immediately. The city wanted to rebuild, to turn tragedy into opportunity. They proposed new safety codes, community oversight, and a complete redesign of the area, something sustainable, transparent, and safe. When they asked me to attend the public hearings, I almost refused. I didn't want to relive it all again. But then I realized this was the moment that mattered most. The chance to turn pain into purpose. I spoke at that hearing not as a victim, but as a witness. I told them about the warnings, the laughter, the threats, the silence that cost everything. And for once, they listened. Not with politeness or impatience, but with genuine attention. The City Council approved a new ordinance, named the Community Transparency Act, requiring all HOA boards to disclose financial records, safety assessments, and conflict of interest declarations publicly. It was a small victory, but it was enough to prove that truth could rebuild what arrogance destroyed. Carol's name became a headline for months. After her hospitalization, she was charged with criminal negligence, falsification of records, and obstruction of safety orders. But what surprised everyone was her testimony. She didn't deny it. Instead, she confessed everything in court: every falsified report, every bribe, every ignored warning. When asked why she finally spoke up, she simply said, "Because the ground reminded me what honesty feels like." The courtroom fell silent. Even through the screens of televised coverage, I could see the weight of her regret. Justice wasn't about punishment anymore, it was about acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement rippled through the community like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. The city decided not to rebuild the collapsed section as residential land. Instead, they turned it into a memorial park, a green space, lined with walking trails, and an open pond where the sinkhole had once been. It was poetic in a way. A wound transformed into reflection. They asked me to help design the dedication plaque. I chose simple words, built on truth, not control. On the day of the unveiling, hundreds gathered. Some were residents, others journalists, others people from nearby neighborhoods who had heard the story and wanted to see it for themselves. As I stood at the podium, looking over faces that once glared and gossiped, I realized that the ground beneath us was no longer divided. We had been forced to face our mistakes together, and that, strangely, had made us whole again. I spoke briefly about accountability, about listening, about what it means to protect a community instead of ruling it. When I finished, a quiet applause rose from the crowd, soft but sincere. It wasn't celebration, it was recognition. And in that moment, I felt the first breath of real peace since this nightmare began. Life slowly returned, though it would never be the same. New families moved into the remaining homes, this time under a restructured association, one run transparently, with monthly open forums and rotating leadership. The old guard was gone, and in its place were people who understood what power could do if left unchecked. They asked if I would join the board, to bring balance and accountability. I hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. Not because I wanted control, but because I wanted to ensure no one else ever felt the isolation I once did. Each meeting, I sat in the same room where it all started, but the atmosphere was different now. No arrogance, no intimidation, just people trying to do right by one another. The first motion passed unanimously to install a permanent geological monitor under the park, to ensure the land remained stable. It was symbolic, yes, but also practical, a promise written into the earth itself. On quiet evenings, I still walk by the park and watch the reflection of the sunset ripple across the pond-esque surface. The air smells cleaner, the silence feels earned. I sometimes wonder if the ground remembers everything it's witnessed: the laughter, the denial, the fall, and the rebuilding. Maybe it doth. Maybe that's why the grass grows thicker here, the flowers bloom brighter. Nature forgives, but it never forgets. And neither do I, because the cracks that once tore through the concrete didn't just split the ground, they split our illusions. They showed us who we were when no one was watching. They forced us to rebuild, not just our homes, but our sense of community, our empathy, our truth. In the end, it wasn't the collapse that defined us, it was what we chose to build after. And as I walk home along the same path that once led to conflict, I can finally say the words that eluded me for years. It's over, and it mattered. But even in peace, there's always a whisper in the wind, a reminder that justice is not a destination, but a decision we make, again and again, to stand on solid ground. Months turned into a full year before the last traces of the disaster were gone, but the memories remained etched deeper than any crack in the ground. The new park had become a gathering place, not just for our neighborhood, but for people from across the city who wanted to understand what happens when power outweighs conscience. Children played where houses once stood, laughter echoing where panic had once filled the air, and each sound felt like a heartbeat for the land itself. I volunteered every weekend, helping plant trees along the walking trail. Each sapling we put into the earth felt like an apology, a quiet promise that we had learned something worth keeping. The city kept its word too. Every HOA across the county was audited within 6 months. New regulations went into effect requiring annual safety inspections and full transparency of budgets and board communications. Some called it overreach, others called it accountability. To me, it was healing, slow, imperfect, but real. The local paper ran a feature about the recovery, titled "The Neighborhood That Refused to Stay Buried." For once, the spotlight didn't feel invasive. It felt deserved. People reached out from other states, sending letters, emails, messages, sharing their own HOA horror stories, thanking me for speaking up. Some had lost homes, others their peace of mind, all because of small groups of people who believed authority meant immunity. Reading their stories reminded me that what happened here wasn't unique, it was a symptom of something bigger, fear disguised as order. I realized then that the story didn't end with rebuilding the neighborhood. It began there, because justice isn't about revenge, it's about responsibility. It's about taking what broke and using it to prevent the next collapse, whether it's a building, a community, or a human spirit. I began speaking at town halls, universities, and local councils. Not as an activist, but as someone who had seen what silence costs. I talked about the illusion of control, about how easily compliance becomes complicity when we stop asking questions. Each time I shared the story, the audience fell silent at the same moment when I described the laughter, that cruel echo before everything fell apart. Maybe they saw a reflection of their own experiences. Maybe they realized how close they had come to ignoring their own warning signs. One evening after a lecture, a young woman approached me. She was shaking slightly as she spoke, saying her HOA was threatening to evict her elderly parents over a ramp they de-installed for her father's wheelchair. She said she'd felt powerless until she heard what happened here, that she was going to fight back now. That moment stayed with me longer than any applause, because it proved that telling the truth doesn't just expose darkness, it lights a path for others. The seasons changed again. By the second anniversary, the park had matured into something almost sacred. Every tree cast long shadows that intertwined like hands, and the pond shimmered in the morning sun, calm and deep as if keeping the past gently beneath its surface. The city installed a small sculpture near the water, an abstract shape of cracked stone, held together by steel bands. It was titled Integrity. On its base was an inscription that read, Strength is what remains when everything else gives way. People often left flowers or notes there. I visited quietly, never lingering long, but always leaving with a sense of gratitude I couldn't quite name. Carol's fate had taken its own turn. After serving her sentence, she disappeared from public view. No one knew where she went. Some said she moved north. Others claimed she started working for a non-profit focused on infrastructure safety. I never confirmed it, but part of me hoped it was true, because if anyone understood how fragile systems and people could be, it was her. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but it came, not because she deserved it, but because I needed it. Holding on to hatred was like living on unstable ground. It cracks everything it touches. Letting it go was my way of rebuilding from the inside out. A few years later, I was invited to a citywide summit on urban planning reforms. When I stepped onto that stage, the memories flooded back. The first crack I'd noticed in the wall. The warning ignored. The night the earth swallowed arrogance whole. But this time, the fear was gone. I spoke about how progress isn't about perfection, it's about listening. Listening to the land, to one another, to the quiet signals that something isn't right. The audience gave a standing ovation, but what mattered more was what came afterward. City officials proposing nationwide policy changes. Inspired by what had started as one ignored warning, the story had grown larger than me, larger than the neighborhood. It had become a reminder of what truth can do when it refuses to stay buried. Years passed. The park became a landmark. People moved in and out. Lives changed. The world kept spinning. But every now and then, when the air was still and heavy before a storm, I'd walk down to the pond and listen. Sometimes I could still feel a faint vibration beneath my feet. The echo of that day the earth demanded honesty. It didn't frighten me anymore. It reminded me that everything solid can crumble if built on denial, but everything broken can stand again if rebuilt with truth. And that's what this place had become. Living example that even after the deepest collapse, there is always a way back to light. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench near the memorial, an elderly man stopped beside me. He looked at the plaque, then at the park stretching beyond it. "You were the one who warned them, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled faintly. "Looks like you were right." "No," I said softly. "I was just loud enough not to be buried." He chuckled, nodded, and walked away, leaving me with the sound of rustling leaves. It was a simple exchange, but it felt like closure, because the truth had finally rooted itself so deeply here that no one could ignore it again. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long golden streaks across the water, I thought about everything this land had taught me. How easily people confuse authority with wisdom. How silence can be as destructive as corruption. And how sometimes, the smallest act speaking up can shift the course of everything. The wind carried the scent of rain. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, but I wasn't afraid. Storms no longer symbolized destruction to me. They meant renewal. The earth's way of breathing, reminding us that pressure doesn't just break, it cleanses. As the first drops fell, I looked around the park and saw people still walking, unbothered, trusting the ground beneath them again. That, to me, was victory. The kind that doesn't make headlines but lingers quietly in the way people live afterward. Before leaving, I took one last look at the memorial. My reflection shimmered on the wet stone, fractured by raindrops yet still whole. That is, when I realized the story wasn't about an HOA or a building or even revenge. It was about choice. The choice to stand firm when it's easier to bow, to speak truth when silence feels safer. And maybe that's the foundation we're all searching for, the kind that never cracks no matter how the earth shifts. I turned toward home, rain drumming softly against my coat, and as I walked away, the thunder rolled deeper across the horizon, echoing like a distant applause. For the first time in years, I felt completely steady. Justice had been done, the community had risen, and the land once broken, once feared, was alive again. And though no one else could hear it, I swear the ground beneath me whispered one final truth. One final truth, that even the deepest collapse can become the beginning of something unshakable when we build it on honesty.